Obviously, people are in many parts of the world right now are trying to get rid of sex, and to deny who we are is not good, is not a way to bring out the best potential in boys and girls and in individuals. So if you see these average differences, well, maybe you should pay attention. And
women are always presented as these innocent, wonderful, fluffy and loving creatures, but that's not quite the truth.
So here you have a woman who has a whole different set of problems than men. And her number one problem is how to keep investing. And you can't invest very well if you're not doing well yourself. I think it's really sad that people aren't considering evolutionary biology, which you talked about more when we understand human nature. It's a shame. And a lot of people want to say, oh, biology or evolution, that no longer applies. And that to me is so dangerous. It takes away who we are as humans. You know, what are our basic instincts? What are our brains like? How have we come to be who we are? And I think that's really a shame to think we're infinitely malleable and not tethered to very mammalian instincts.
You've been looking into the differences between men and women in your research for years. What one finding would you say was the one that surprised you the most?
Oh, okay, let me think about that. I guess I started out by assuming that girls and women were communal and caring for one another in a way that boys and men weren't. And that was certainly what everybody said. And I would say probably still do 40 years after I began my doctoral work. And so, or more than that now. And so I am always surprised still at how young boys and oftentimes young men, I think less so in older men, just take care of one another, interact together, cooperate, are tolerant, put up with stuff that I would never put up with. And that's still, I would say, my whole career, that has just shocked me. People don't like to hear it. They get actually upset with me, and women get upset with me. And that doesn't surprise me anymore, but it used to. And of course, we have lots of problems now that boys and men in particular are having. And, you know, they always say, oh, now men can't have friends and boys can't have friends. I don't find that at all when I go into schools, when I, you know, look around neighborhoods and so forth. The types of friendships are very different between boys or between men compared to girls and women. But I still see incredible just tolerance and caring between men, whether it's on sports team, whether I read about it in the military or talk to people in the military, whether I'm in the school. And it's just time to have fun. And the boys are just having a blast and the girls are figuring out who's their best friend. And, you know, and of course, girls can be tremendously supportive. And I'm not disagreeing with the idea that girls and women aren't more empathic. I think they are. In terms of when there's a problem. But boys and men in their own way are very, very supportive. So in other words, they may not say, oh, poor you, let's talk about it, you know, or maybe you should go to therapy, but they'll go over there and they'll do something. So it's not like they don't notice. Okay, that's my best answer.
Okay. So in terms of the type of relationships or alliances, perhaps, that boys and girls form, what would you say are sort of the key characteristics of those relationships in each camp?
Yes. So, you know, always I have noted the tremendous bonding between, and I'm talking about now unrelated individuals. So I'm not talking about kinship. So when it comes to kinship, females are totally close to their families, girls to their mothers and so forth. And boys, I think a little bit less so. But when it comes to unrelated individuals, you have these almost familial-like best friend relationships that develop between girls. And if they can last, they can be like kin. So in other words, if you happen to meet someone when you're 4 or 5 years old and you're a girl and you manage to maintain that friendship for your whole life, then that can be effective like a sister. And that's really, really wonderful if you can do that. So this close bonding, this discussion of everything, this help with things that are really difficult, girls and women, I think, can be wonderful, wonderful about that. Boys and men, my sense is they're more activity bound. They're more invested in one another because they're doing something together. So whether that's, playing some kind of ball, other kind of sport, or they're, engaged in a science project or the war or government or whatever it is, there's tremendous camaraderie between the boys and the men. And I feel really sad now, that social media has divided people so much so that boys are not seeing other boys. Like literally, they go to school, the classrooms are so regimented that it's hard to just have fun and be with other people more naturally. And, girls are so worried, of course, about who's going to say what negative about them, but it's really sad. But I don't look at social media. I don't study that at all, but looking in real life at what kids do when they're actually together, which to me is what natural life is, then you see, to me, very, very different relationships and a whole host of things that go along with that. So that girls are very attuned to exactly what nonverbal gesture or facial expression, whatever it is that just came on to her friend's face, or maybe somebody she's a little worried about's face or whatever. And boys wouldn't even notice if that happened, right? Because they're much more upfront. They're much more, yelling things, touching, pushing, whatever it is. And so it's a different way of communication. It's a different enjoyment. Boys obviously are much rougher with one another. To me, that's so clear. And of course, I teach courses on non-humans. So a lot of what I say comes from the research I've done with non-humans, or at least reading about them and trying to compare humans with them. And so, you have boys by early on, just like in other species, engaging in rough and tumble play. And that is rough, right? And girls don't generally want to do that. Not to say girls might not want to chase one another around. And I think girls getting in sports is really changing things. And that's very exciting. But it's new. They have, I think hundreds and hundreds of years now of some of it archaeological evidence on the types of artifacts they find. And they find the types of descriptions and where men are buried or whatever involve a lot more sports games. And there's certainly lots and lots of evidence for this from the written record. And girls, this is really new. But I do think sports changes things for girls and makes it more activity-based, meaning you have then more tolerance. You don't worry about every little thing that the other person is doing because you've got to get through the game. And the most important thing is to beat the other side. So you just don't have time to process all that. So it's very different. But generally, when you look at little kids, it's boys who are engaging in this rough and tumble play, and they're really not so concerned with others' feelings, not concerned with whether somebody hurts them. But they like it. They actually like that. So that's certainly my sense, and that's from my research from decades. But again, when things become online, of course, boys are playing these shooter games and so forth, and young men are playing them too. So the types of activities are still very different, what's going on online. But I think it's really sad that both boys and girls are not engaging in face-to-face interactions. Okay.
I think the education and how it's been sort of more less active, I suppose. The classrooms, the whole setup has been getting less and less active to perhaps accommodate more scalable system. And reading many books about it, but also watching a little toddler boy that is growing up, I'm not surprised that boys are struggling to sort of sit steady for 5 hours, because little boys, they are feral most of the time. and they've got wild, just completely wild amount of energy that they need to burn through the day. And for me, like, if my toddler is like getting on our nerves, all we need to do is get him outside and let him run. And then he just turns into the most lovable little kid ever. But if we don't tire him out, it's like literally living with a working spaniel that hasn't been walked for a week. This is what it feels like. So, like, when I'm
Yes.
reading now books about, the boys are struggling, it's not necessarily that they've got ADHD or things like that. It's just that they can't contain this energy. So when I was reading your book, Warriors and Warriors, I'm not even sure whether I'm saying this right. It was really clear how boys, for them, almost growing up was very physically, for sort of the feedback loops that they were relying on were very physical. And then
Yes.
for the girls, it was a little bit more emotional based, like relationship based and relationship building type of structures that they thrived on. So when you actually study young boys and girls, how soon do you see the differences, sex differences, coming to play?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a major review with, I guess it's starting at 3 months of age. And it really shows that starting at 3 months of age, boys are more surgent, girls are, that means more forceful, whether it's crying or smiling or whatever. And girls are more self-controlled, right? They probably don't cry as forcefully as boys do. I'm just completing a study now with 3 to 6 month olds, right? And you can see the boys, they just can't pay attention as easily, right? And they wiggle more. And, there are always exceptions. So people will say, oh, my child isn't like that. And that's true. None of us is exactly a prototype of a boy or a girl. And I know that everybody's concerned about people who don't feel comfortable in their skin as boy or girl. And all of us differ to some extent in our classic female versus male prototypical traits. Nonetheless, there are average differences that are to me really, really important. And being the mother of a son or sons is very different in most cases than being the mother of a daughter. It really is different. I think, Roy Baumeister made a really funny point. He said a lot of people think there's a preference for boys, for sons, because more people are likely to stop having a child after they have a son. So finally they got there, right? They had their daughters, they have the son, then they stop. And that is shown in a lot of places around the world. And they interpret it, and there are places where there's a preference for a son. But Roy Baumeister had this wonderful interpretation where he said, once you have a son, you realize that's really hard having a child. And maybe I don't want to do that again. And I thought that was really, really brilliant interpretation, because for a lot of parents, it is a whole different scenario. Like, your life is completely different in terms of how much you sleep and how fast you run and how much you can just relax during the day and during vacations and so forth if you have, little boys versus you have little girls. And the other nice thing about having a little girl is they oftentimes want to take care of your younger children versus a little boy. The data are really clear cross culturally that little boys are not sibling caretakers to the same extent that girls are. Girls in preschool, in the world where we have preschools, the girls will take care of their dolls and they will cook for them and they will put them to sleep and they will help them when they're sick. Even after they die, they will take care of them and then they'll bring them back to life and bring them to the hospital. This can go on and on and on. But, for boys, there's a few boys who are interested for a little bit of time, but then they're off, running over each other's heads with their tricycles or whatever they're doing. And so, you really see girls in worlds like hunter-gatherer societies or more simpler societies where we don't have preschools, taking care of their younger offspring. I mean, this is common. When I was in Africa, tiny little girls have their, infant siblings attached to their backs, and they're very proud and very capable and taking care of them, and it's much, much rarer with boys. So it's so many things. It's the activities, it's the interests, it's the activity level, it's the so many things. It's a relation to family and, just wanting to sit on top of your mother and listen to a story versus wanting to run outside instead of doing that. And, these kinds of things, to me, they're huge. Obviously, people are in many parts of the world right now are trying to get rid of sex. And to some extent, I support that in the sense that gives more opportunities to girls and women that they haven't had. On the other hand, to deny who we are is not good. Is not a way to bring out the best potential in boys and girls and in individuals. So if you see these average differences, well, maybe you should pay attention. And of course, bring out the potential in any individual is what we would hope to do in society or in our families.
I think everyone can see the culture's sort of push to present women as just average or, smaller on average and slimmer on average versions of men. But it does make me laugh because it's not the same. And the one thing that really fascinated me about your research, and this was more about older humans, was essentially the female intersexual competition and how, I suppose, under-discussed this subject is, because I think in the culture, women are always presented as these innocent, wonderful, fluffy and loving creatures, but that's not quite the truth. So what can you tell us about female intersexual competition?
Okay, so I think that's the kind of corollary to my saying how cooperative boys can be. The other thing that I, started learning about when I made my original observations as a doctoral student was how much girls are constantly trying to figure out, how to deal with the other girls there. And of course, women too. And I've done a lot of studies on that. And why on earth shouldn't females compete just like males? Doesn't even make any sense, And I think the age-old argument is an evolutionary biological argument that, oh, well, males, they can have lots of different females, so therefore they should compete with each other so they can be the most successful. And females, well, there's always somebody to inseminate them, whatever species you're talking about, so they don't need to compete. But in fact, when it comes to getting food and when it comes to getting shelter, and I'm not just talking about humans now, right? Females got to figure this out. And now it turns out the newest research is showing, oh, females actually benefit from having more than one mate. Females do benefit in different ways, and it depends on the species. And of course, humans are more pair bonded than they are polygynous or polyandrous. So usually there's marriage, usually between a man and a woman. That's how our bonding system goes. So that means both men and women are competing for a mate, right? Especially if you're not going to have that many other ones. And if you're talking about our modern birth control societies, well, we might be competing for sexual partners. And so there's a lot of things that we finally realize women are competing for all the time. And girls certainly know this. The problem is, or the way I frame it, is that girls don't compete in the way that boys do. So this kind of came to me most clearly, like maybe 2 years ago, I wrote a paper on this. What you see with boys is what we call contest. So very easy. It's like, who's going to get that ball? Well, I'm going to hit you over the head and I'm going to take it from you, right? I'm actually going to contest it. Or if you think about football, whichever, whether that's soccer here or actually, football in Europe or American football or basketball, it's literally grabbing something or pushing somebody away or whatever the rules permit and letting you triumph, right? Letting you beat them. And it's very direct. And so this is what boys and men love. They love to do that. And with girls in sports, you're getting a little bit more of that, but there's usually rules that prevent it from being exactly the same. So there's to minimize the damage, because more females are much more concerned about protecting themselves. And there's a lot of research that I've done on that. But anyway, but girls then, how do they get what they want? And that's a big question. So I have this ongoing study of this now where we put together 2 girls and we say, okay, you can choose stickers from a box. So go ahead. But there's only room for one child to choose them. There's plenty for both, but there's not that many, there's 6 to choose from. So they can each choose 2. So how do you figure that out? Oh, wow. This is a big problem for girls because they both go up there. Sometimes they go up there holding hands, but only one can fit. So what do you do? And this is something that girls do not like. And I don't like it either, right? I don't like having to go head to head or push somebody out of the way. Sometimes girls will put their arm out, and these are 4 and 5-year-olds, and push the other away, but very subtly and kind of looking up like, oh, it's not me doing this. But more often it's like, well, maybe we can work out a plan at 4 or 5 years of age. Maybe you should go first, second. So then I can go first here, and then second, you can go first. And it's like a very convoluted way of reasoning it. And it's a lot of effort paid to this. And so the way I talk about, and this is based on the non-human animal literature, the way I talk about female competition is what they call scramble competition. And I know that sounds really odd, but it's the idea that instead of having face-to-face blows or a contest, what you do is you go off quietly and try to outdo the other one. So what does that look like? Well, if you're talking about children who are in school, you try to get the best grades, and then maybe you don't say anything about it. So they don't come after you, other girls, and make fun of you because you're doing so well. No, you might say, oh, that was so hard. I don't think I did well. And then you don't say it if you got a perfect score. Or when it comes to the mate market, you might try to find a male, not when there are other females around and you have to compete by looking prettier or sounding sweeter or whatever is the value in that culture that you're supposed to do. You go off by yourself and try to track down the guy where he might be, and you don't have to engage in that competition. And so, I find it very funny because I was living in a little town in upstate New York here in America, and they had a dress list for the prom. So they had to make sure that no 2 girls going to the same high school prom wore the same dress, because that would be no good. So the girls would come in maybe with a friend, but only with, 1 or 2 others, oftentimes with their family, their mothers. And they would try to get the prettiest dress, right? The idea is to have the prettiest dress, right? And to make sure nobody else has it. And so, but that's done not with, oh my gosh, there's somebody else in the dress store and I'm going to kick her out so I can grab that dress from her. That would be a contest over the dress. But rather, I'm going to go there where nobody else is there, make sure I get the best possible dress. And then everybody will look at me and say, wow. And we all do that. I'm totally guilty of that myself when I was younger or whatever. Or we try to get the best house or the best car. And I recently, published a study showing that, even women get very upset with other women who have things that typically women don't care about, like territory, or a car. And they really don't like it more than men don't like it. So if a guy has a great car, the other guys were more likely to say, wow, as opposed to, no, I don't like that. And the girls were like, a great car. And these are the women mostly because they're young. They're older. Sorry, they're not so young. And it was like, wow, I was so surprised at the number of things, being on a city council or having a really pretty garden or being able to do things, whatever skills I asked about. The women invariably were more upset about it with other women than men were with other men. So it's there early in life. It's there all the way through, as far as I know. I now visit my mother. She's in assisted living, and the women are having fights all the time about who gets to sit with who and who's friends with who. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's nasty. It is really nasty. And it's mostly women because women outlive men. And it's very interesting, very funny. I probably shouldn't say this given things in the United States right now, but they played the debate was last night between Biden and Trump, and people have very strong feelings in this country about that. Well, they refused to play it at my mother's assisted living facility because they were afraid it would actually come to blows. So everybody had to be in their own room with their own TV. Usually they have, public movies, and they try to get they do things and have kids come and sing, and everybody comes, and all kinds of lovely events. They bring dogs, but oh no, I was like, they're not going to show it to you. So, we had to get my mother online through using her computer and putting it on for her so she could watch it all by herself. So it's quite nasty. So I can attest that from as early as I look at kids all the way through the end of life, women are very competitive, but it's usually not in contests. It's usually going off and saying, I want you to be my friend and not be friends with her, subtly, or finding something they want, whether it's a house or a dress or a man or whatever it is, or a friend, quietly when nobody else is there. And the language is very subtle that girls and women use to compete. It might be even just gestures that boys and men, as I mentioned, wouldn't even notice.
Okay, 2 questions there. There is the assumption out there that men are just more competitive than women, full stop, no discussion to be had. Is that true, or is it more the fact that because men use different strategies that are more visible to compete, the women's sort of competition world just flies under the radar? Or are just women more competitive about very, very specific things? For example, resources when they have got children. Because I know you've done some research that was really interesting about the competition of married women with children and how that changes the findings, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that latter, I didn't compare married with unmarried women. So, I can't say, but I was so shocked because I thought by the time you're married, maybe you're going to be less competitive now. So that's why I did that study, because I thought, okay, you're competing for a husband, and it really can have a huge influence, especially if you don't have that many resources yourself, because oftentimes women will take time off to take care of their children, and that's really needed. And to have a man who can contribute resources to you and your children is just so unbelievably beneficial if you can work that out. So I thought, well, by the time you now have that man, maybe then you're not going to be so competitive. And that's why I did the study to which you're referring. And that did not show that at all. It just not at all. I asked women about women they know and how competitive those women would be if one other woman got something that the others didn't have. So it was kind of a tripartite study. But basically, it's what I was reporting before. Women were more competitive than men. It didn't matter whether it was a masculine type of trait. All that mattered was it was something really good to have. Whether it was, as I said, a car or a beautiful house or a job in the city council or whatever it was. And so what floored me about that study is that I expected just what you said. Oh, well, women won't be so competitive anymore because they've got the house and they needed to have children and they've got what they need. But in fact, it didn't go away. And this study was done, in a few countries, and it was a self-report, but people were asked about people they know, real people that they know, and how they would feel. And so it didn't go away. And given, I see these women at the end, this is just anecdotal, but at the end of their lives where my mother lives, I cannot believe it doesn't go away, and I don't think it goes away. And in some sense, I feel really good about that, because a lot of times women are presented as passive, as not looking out, not being able to take care of themselves, not looking out for themselves, as opposed to my view of women, which is it's overwhelming to have children. It's absolutely overwhelming. And you yourself are going to be the primary caregiver. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions, but generally that's how it goes. So if you are the primary caregiver, you need all the help you can get. And oftentimes women live with their husband's family. Not always, but on average, humans are like chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living genetic relatives. And that is usually, but not always, the females go and live and reproduce not with their own families right there. So that means the males are incredibly valuable if they will invest in you, because you don't have your kin there. And if you don't have your kin there, having a man who will invest, and his family and anyone else, is really, really important. So that means you have to keep the other women away who might steal him. You have to keep the other women away. They've shown this in polygynous societies, who share a husband, who might steal where you're sleeping, or your pots and pans, or might try to poison your child. And they do this sometimes. And I'm not saying men aren't more violent. They're always more violent than women. But women are looking out for themselves. They are not passive. They're trying to figure out how to best take care of themselves and their children. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's complicated. If you've got several children, if you've got not a supportive family around, you may be quiet, you may be smiling, you may be figuring out in this culture how to get what I need in the best possible way, but you're thinking and you're agentic, just like men are. And you're trying to figure things out so that you can pass on your genes to the next generation. I am at heart an evolutionary biologist, but just from a psychological perspective, there's a lot that has to be figured out when you have young children. 50% of children died before they reach their 15th birthdays, before they reach adolescence. Throughout the world, we've only changed that now in a lot of contemporary societies. It's been changing all over the world due to healthcare and hygiene changes. But 50%, that's what our brains have evolved, right? And so 50% chance that every one of your children is going to die. That means you have 4 kids, 2 of them on average are going to die. Wow. You have to do everything imaginably possible to prevent that investment from dying. And so that kind of stress, I've had people I know working in the emergency rooms here in Boston, and the amount of stress from a mother versus a father when you bring in a child who is in critical trouble, it's incomparable. So you have a lot of reasons to compete for resources for yourself and your child.
Okay. As you were talking about it, all I keep thinking is, wow, that's expensive. Metabolically speaking, all that competition is very, very expensive. Brain power isn't free. So why would evolution made it so cumbersome from the energetic point of view for women to compete like that? Why not come up with a simple little process that doesn't cost that much in terms of the energy expenditure? What is the underlying benefit there?
Okay, so this is life history theory, and there certainly are no firm answers to your question. It's a really, really good question. And that is, newer organisms typically, and that means from an evolutionary point of view, so we're talking about millions of years, typically, if they can evolve to be bigger, and they evolve to have larger brains, and they evolve to live longer, and they evolve to have children who gestate for longer, and they evolve to have children who lactate for longer, and children who have much longer childhood before they're able to reproduce. And they're much less likely to have more than one child at a time compared to other species. And this is the great apes, and this is us. It sounds really stupid. And from your question, it is stupid. It's so much more energetically costly. Why not, be born, have your offspring immediately, have a lot of them, hope somebody lives before something bad happens to you. Don't spend that energy. Don't invest the energy into growing your body and delaying reproduction and then having these kids who take forever to grow up. That just sounds so stupid, right? And it's a really, really good question. So somehow, evolutionarily, it paid. It pays for us to spend a long time growing up, not being able to reproduce for a long time, and then having children who are complicated, who take forever to, first gestate and then lactate and then figure out the world themselves. So that means our brains are bigger. So that goes with this whole suite of slow life history traits. And that doesn't sound right, just the way you put it. Nonetheless, if you just extrapolate to your question, the idea is somehow you do really well having a big brain and having to negotiate all kinds of things in life. And so one of the big things that many people talk about, and certainly Robin Dunbar has emphasized this, is the more social relations you have to figure out, the bigger brain you have. Mm-hmm. And what I would argue is, for whatever reason, I don't know the direction of causality, we have these really big brains as humans. And one of the things that many people think is they're used very much for figuring out social relations. And part of figuring out social relationships is who are your allies and who are your adversaries. And they may change, one may flip and become the other, whatever, but constantly being vigilant, constantly being able to figure out who you can trust and who you do not trust, who has something you want, who wants to get something from you. That's a part of having a big brain, and it must have paid off because that's who evolved over time. And we are the most recent of this long history of just mammalian, let alone pre-mammalian evolution. So I can't answer your question. It's a really interesting one, but all I can say is the brain is there. Both men and women have it, and a lot of the functions seem to have to do with negotiating social relationships.
And specifically about the strategies for competition, why women don't compete like men do? Because if we were competing against each other, why not have a fight over a donut or an apple that you found? Way more straightforward. So why women pick, or the evolution picked for women, more brain expensive way to compete?
Okay, so what I would argue is it's not just for women. I wrote a paper recently on this for women, but I argue that it's a female mammalian adaptive strategy. And that is, if you are going to gestate for a long period of time, almost a year for humans, and then you are going to nurse for a couple of years, which is the standard in hunter-gatherer societies, and then you've got a juvenile who doesn't grow up very fast. And in our society, we slowed this down. So you have adolescents who are still around after age 30, right? And you are required to take care of them. And you add to that you are a woman, and usually there's a lot of evidence now that women invest not only in their children, but in their grandchildren. Then you're talking about a huge amount of time where it's highly adaptive. It means you're much more likely to survive, and your children survive, and your grandchildren survive if you invest. So here you have a woman who has a whole different set of problems than men. And her number one problem is how to keep investing. And you can't invest very well if you're not doing well yourself. So it seems to me that whether you're talking about aggression or in terms of fighting another individual or hurting yourself because you ran into something and you're in pain, or whatever it is, women are going to be more self-protective. And it makes total sense to me. A man can pass on his genes as soon as he's reproductively able. Most women don't want to mate with a man. This is true for other species too, with males, until they're big and tough and can maybe provide some benefits to the female and at least show that they have something going for them. And so you have men or males who don't reproduce as soon as females or women, but then you get these men who can reproduce fairly quickly with a lot of different females. And they can, if they, can find the females, or sometimes they force them. And so, and if the male dies right after reproducing, meaning inseminating a female, that's it, right? There's a female there for the rest of her life who's going to take care of these offspring. And even in non-humans, yes.
His
Go ahead.
evolutionary goal has been achieved.
Absolutely, that's it. So, we know women live longer than men. As far as I know, there are a few exceptions here and there, but it's so ubiquitous. It's across the world. It's across the centuries for which there are data. Women live longer. That's why at nursing homes, you find a lot more women than men. And the idea is women have been selected to live longer because they are so much more advantageous as grandmothers than men are as grandfathers. I mean, this is what the data show, and it's pretty cross-culturally clear that that's true. And so you have to be incredibly careful as a woman. Women are more likely to wake up in the middle of the night. And that's a good idea if you're in a place that's at least dangerous, because in the dark, things can come in and might hurt you or your children. Women are more likely to do all kinds of things. They are more likely to respond more quickly. And so women are dubbed, and girls, more sensitive, which I hate that idea, because to me, sensitive is a demeaning term, but it should not be. Women are more sensitive, meaning they're more vigilant and more able to see something that could hurt them or their families. And so they get disgusted more easily, much more easily than men. They are more fearful much more quickly than men. And all of these reactions are ways to prevent dying of you or your children. And so it makes total sense to me that you should avoid contests, because if you punch somebody out, which sometimes I feel like doing, I know that probably they're going to turn around and punch me back, or they could. And that's something that frightens me. And that's good for the survival of my genes. But if you're a man, you don't care that much about that. So anyway, you have these changes. Now, in fairness, men's testosterone goes down after they get married, and particularly after they have children. And so they're going to be less likely to get into contests for the same reason. Because if those men who choose to engage in fathering behaviors, and obviously there's a lot of variability in that, but they are much more, concerned about not getting hurt. But contests, you get hurt. And that's why I think there are, at least here, I know there's some of the sports, the rules for the sports are much more likely to prevent women from touching each other than men, because women don't want to get hurt. They don't want to take that chance. And that's smart. That's really smart.
I think as you were talking, I remembered one of the research projects that you looked into, which where you were listing all of these ways in which women are more sensitive. Let's use that word because it's probably best, even though probably for some people it will have some negative connotations. Let's just pause it here and say that we are not using it in this way, but it's easier for the conversation. And one of the ways in which women are more sensitive, they even respond to vaccines much more powerfully. And that was really something that stuck with me. So on a wide range of issues, women are essentially more prone to detecting threat, whether it's real or perhaps not real. And what I find really fascinating with potential implications of that is that huge part of modernity is actually weighing heavy on that protective reaction mechanism, which is unique for women. And I wonder, how much of the cancellation culture or silencing some dissident voices and difficult conversations, for example, could be the downstream effect of that mechanism.
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, I generally don't find that women would be more likely than men to cancel, because men will cancel you out by a punch to your nose, right? And they cancel all the time, right? And they scream and they yell and they do all kinds of things. And if you're dead, you're canceled, right? And men are so much more likely than women to kill others. So to me, that's the ultimate form of cancellation, is killing. And homicide rates are 9-1 in some countries, men to women. So, I mean, that to me is really if you want to be honest about it, that's real cancellation. So, but if you're talking about something really much, much less severe, but that could be emotionally upsetting. And, I do think it's clear women have stronger immune systems than men, so they respond to pathogens more strongly or parasites, but also to emotional upset. And women are much more likely to have PTSD. And it is upsetting for women to be emotionally distraught. And so it causes a stronger response in women. And therefore, following up on your logic, it makes sense to me that women would want to stay away more from others who are going to say mean things or say things they would upset them. And so you might get that kind of, in that particular way, oh, please don't tell me that. I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to hear it, because I'm doing what my immune system does. I'm protecting myself emotionally. And it's very clear women have a harder time because they have stronger emotional reactions. It's a harder time to, I don't know what's the best word, but come down from those strong emotions, right? And so if you have somebody saying things, right, that really upset you, then, oh, that's going to be like harder on you than it would be on a man, right? And so therefore it's an immune response, only it's an emotional immune response. And I could very well imagine that. I haven't studied that. And I do get upset when people say that women cancel more than men, because, as I said, depends on your definition of canceling, right? And so it's very easy for men to just punch somebody out and they're canceled. But yes, in terms of being around others, I always am surprised at some men. They'll like marry a woman who has very different political views and adopt her views, right? And that's a big thing now in the United States because it's so polarized. I'm like, you could just give up your own views and adopt her views? How could you do that? I don't care that much. But for women, that's much bigger ask, I think. And women are having a harder time with that because it's like, oh, I feel so strongly about this. And usually when you have political views or whatever the views are, you are coming from a family and a mini culture that shares those views. And now it's like, wait a second, I have to change. No, I don't think I can do that very easily, or it'll cause a lot of upheaval in me. And I don't want that. So in that way, I would agree with you.
It was the research from Corey Clark that made me think about it, because I think she was looking at, the researchers that were essentially looking into potentially controversial subjects. And when she was doing, part of her research was basically contacting all the professors and researchers and all that, and to ask them certain questions. And from her research, she said that women were much more in favor of, for example, silencing or not publishing research that is true but could be perceived as hurtful, for example. And that sort of made me really think, like, how deep is this need for women to sort of to keep the waters like still, to keep everyone happy. And I think I think nowadays the cancel culture, it's so wide that it's almost perhaps not helpful when we are discussing it and sort of just labeling everything cancel culture. Part of me sort of wonders how much of what we are, for example, seeing is sort of the downstream effects of some of those mechanisms that are biologically there and clearly are still affecting us humans, or to what degree they are actually affecting us. And I think that there was, I'm going to butcher this one, so I won't tell you exactly the research, because it just won't come to me now, but it was something that was essentially done very recently, that is essentially showing that young women are going way more towards sort of liberal, very tolerant, very lovingly sort of path, whilst men are turning, for example, more conservative. And I was sort of thinking, well, are women really, really tolerant, for example, or is it more that they don't want to stir the waters. So, like, would women be staying silent, for example, when there is something in the culture that they are not happy about because of the fear of being socially excluded, or because they are naturally more agreeable? Or is it just both of these factors are different side of the same driver from the evolutionary point of view?
Right. Well, that's a lot, and I do know those papers you're referring to. I mean, I think a little bit is competition, because I think if you can get together with other people and say, this is the right way to do it, this is the ethical way, that's always a problem. That is always a problem. That's basically saying my group is right and your group is wrong. And we all think these things. But sometimes, at least for me, when I get older, I think, I was wrong, right? And I'm wrong about other things. And that's part of life. And that's part of growing up. And that's part of meeting different people. And that's part of, to me, really interesting development. So I think a little bit what's going on with this women is actually social exclusiveness of other people, right? It's not, oh, I think this is so right. I think it's, we're better than the other people. And I have this close bond to these other people. And we feel great. And it really makes me feel comfortable because I'm not alone, and so forth. But it's presented as we are more ethical, right? And the problem with that is there's a bunch of women who don't feel like that on the other side, who are conservative, who have their own points of view, and they do the same thing, right? And I totally get that. I mean, people always say, oh, well, men are more warlike than women. And absolutely. And across species, males are much more likely to go out and fight other groups. However, I am firmly convinced that it's not that men are more hating of other groups. I think women are just as hating, if not more, but they're not the ones that fight because they don't engage in contests. They engage in scramble competition. So you say to the men, you know, you go and you fight. And there's other species where it's the same thing. The males are expected to die for the group because they're not taking care of the offspring. And that makes total sense to me. But my feeling about a lot of this stuff that's coming out, and I know the papers you referred to, is I don't think the ethics here are the key problem. I know I have my own take on this. I have no evidence. I haven't looked at this. This is just my own interpretation. It's not that one group is better than the other. It's that you have your group, and it's a form of intolerance. And it's, to me, very scary to not let other people think. Do I think men do this all the time? Absolutely. But they're upfront about it. They're more upfront about it. I hate that other group, right? And I want to get rid of them. And, you know, we're going to take over this country and make it X, Y, and Z because that's better. And they say it like that. And that is cancel, and that's intolerance. But they're not saying it's ethical, right? They're just not using that word. It's just right, or it's what they want. But the females are using the mantra of morality, right? Oh, we're right because we're more moral. Now, wait a second, right? There's nobody out there saying who's more moral and who isn't more moral. And if you say, oh, you can't do this to one group of people, well, you might accidentally be doing it to another group of people by virtue of what you did with the first group. And so then you get this discrimination against these people, but not those people. And it's so convoluted, and it's, to me, dangerous. But I'm not saying that I don't think women do it more than men. I mean, certainly in the paper you referred to, that is a academic study, at least the first one you referred to, of which I'm aware, where they went across a whole bunch of different fields. And women now are very involved in academia and very involved in this. And I think in the academic universe, women are probably, I believe the results, being more likely to cancel than men are. But get out of that and go to the, government, or go into, religious organizations or whatever, where men are usually holding more power, and they're doing the same thing. They're just upfront and they say it. So a little bit it irks me when people are going after the liberal women and saying, oh, how could you do this? Because the men, and particularly conservative men, are doing this too. So I think in the end, what I really appreciate what you ask, which is this a kind of deeper issue? And it's just coming out with these words and this particular context right here, because that's what's on offer in our culture. But I would say, yeah, this is in group, out group, discrimination. Women do it. They're not going to fight. Academia usually, I don't ever fight with anyone in terms of beating them up, but debate is very, very important. And of course, in other places, there is actual fighting going on, and fighting is very important. And one of the things that I guess I really like looking at little kids, because they don't have a problem fighting, but the girls do, right? The boys don't, right? And part of the problem and the big headache is, as you described with your toddler, is when you have boys in a classroom, you're just much more tired. As a teacher, versus if some of the boys maybe are absent that day, you have kind of a day off because the girls are just a lot sweeter. That doesn't mean that girls don't have strong feelings and don't prefer some girls and hate other girls. It just means you don't see it because it's more scramble competition as opposed to contest. And when you talk about agreeable, I think that's a very smart idea, to be agreeable if you want to protect yourself. So all the ways in which I talk about how females protect themselves, one of the biggest ones is being agreeable. You smile, right? You are polite. You are considerate. Doesn't matter what you really think, right? But in that particular situation, it's a really good strategy. I do not think females are more agreeable. Every single study around the world shows females are more agreeable, because you ask them and we will all say, oh yes, we're agreeable. We like whatever the items are on that well-known measure, right? Where they look at agreeableness as one of the big 5 factors. And yes, women are always saying more agreeable, but go home and ask their children and ask their husbands and ask their mothers how agreeable they are. Not agreeable. When we're home, we are not agreeable.
Yeah.
Nobody's asking about real life. To me, this is kind of pop psychology. I know it's ubiquitous. I know everybody talks about it, but at home, that's not what you see. But when you open the door, your smile goes on, and your politeness and all the things that you do at home goes out the door, right? And
I wonder whether actually, like, personality, particularly agreeableness, because I know the research and I've dived into the big 5 personality, and I was looking into agreeableness a lot because I consistently come up as very, very low in agreeableness, which my family would definitely agree with. But it kind of, as you were talking about it, it popped into my mind that perhaps it's, whether it's outward towards the world, towards the alien world, which could be harmful to you, or whether it's at home when you are safe, because then you can afford to take the risks because you're not going to be punched in the face or stabbed or whatever by another ape that is trying to eye up the apple that you are also trying to compete for, or whatever resource we're talking about. So I wonder whether actually those personality traits, particularly that one, is whether it's more tested when what we are like with most people, not what we are like in the comfort of our homes with our closest. Does that make sense?
I totally agree. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I always tell my classes now, I'm going to say what this is like out in the world, but at home, it's totally wrong. Everything I'm saying is totally wrong. And everything. Now, in fairness, domestic violence is a huge problem around the world, right? They say something like 1 out of 4 women are abused by, some intimate partner. So then you have to be really, really, really agreeable, right? If you're going to get beaten up, and for whatever reason you feel that you have to stay and you can't leave and there's no one to protect you or nowhere to go, or you don't have the resources. So then you have to be really agreeable. But if, as you said, you're in a nice family situation, these are your kin, they're your children, maybe your parents come to visit, hopefully your spouse is not a domestic abuser, then they need you because they are adaptive enough to know that you're the one that's going to keep their genes going. And so they're not going to hurt you. And of course, women will beat up their kids, and it's awful to say, but women will hit their kids because they're not going to hit back. That's never going to hurt you as long as they're not adolescents, if they're younger. So absolutely. But the idea that women are more agreeable in the home is crazy unless you're talking about really violent men. And there are. There are always
Yeah.
a lot of violent men. But certainly when we're with sisters or even brothers, right? And children and cousins and people who are invested in our genes being passed on, invested on us because they've known us for a long time, then it's totally different. And none of those characterizations of women as passive or agreeable or whatever, so compassionate and tolerant apply, because we have to get through life. We have to cook dinner. We have to make sure the child gets to the doctor if something's wrong. We have to keep the parent who could help us in as good health as possible. We have so many things on our minds, and probably nowadays we're working too. And certainly hunter-gatherer women were not staying home. They were going out and producing the food and gathering it and so forth. So this idea that women, are all these stereotypes, whether I started with saying more cooperative or, less competitive, all these stereotypes, and they don't apply to real life, in my opinion. They just don't.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look carefully, you'll see there's a lot of competition even outside the house, and for good reason, because these are individuals who could take away your husband, take away your resources, to invade your property, do all kinds of things.
That's really fascinating. Okay, so as we're sort of heading towards the end, is there anything important you feel that we perhaps didn't mention that you still wanted to sort of throw in there in terms of the topics that we've covered?
Um, no, we've covered a lot. I'm just trying to think of some of my latest studies. No, I guess the only thing I would say is I think it's really sad that people aren't considering evolutionary biology, which you talked about more when we understand human nature. To me, the courses I teach look at non-humans and apply the principles to humans. And I think I've been trying to do that my whole life, to take from that literature and apply it. It rarely happens. So it's a shame. And a lot of people want to say, oh, biology or evolution, that no longer applies. And that to me is so dangerous. It takes away who we are as humans.
Mm-hmm.
What are our basic instincts? What are our brains like? How have we come to be who we are? And I think that's really a shame, to think we're infinitely malleable and not tethered to very mammalian instincts.
Mm-hmm. I think part of it might be that there is this tendency for us to whitewash perhaps some of the darker aspects of being human, perhaps. And I think part of the reason why evolutionary biology as a field has been quite unpopular, certainly in culture, is because they look at some of the stuff that helped us evolve, and if you discuss it, some people see it as excusing it, whilst I'm very much of the belief that the more we understand about those undercurrents that drive us, the more agency we can actually have about our own behavior. So that's been really fascinating. Can you tell people what can they expect from you and your research over the next couple of years? What are you working on? And where can people find your work?
Okay, well, I mean, my work is available on the internet. You can just, look up Google Scholar or whatever search, engine that you use. And the kinds of things I'm working on are particularly now looking at, I've always looked at groups and dyads, but I'm particularly looking at sex ratios and how things change if you have all males or all females or 2 to 1 in terms of alliances, in terms of coping with competition, in terms of getting the resources that you want. So I'm trying to look at that systematically now in little kids. I love looking at little kids because in terms of learning, to me, observations are the best. And all we can do with adults, really, because we're also self-conscious, is ask questions. And to me, a lot of understanding of humans is based on answers to questions. And I couldn't tell you anything about myself because I don't know, right? On top of, I don't want to say, or, the other reasons people might not be honest, but mostly it's because I just don't know what drives me. I say something because I'm supposed to, but when you look at little kids and you present a specific situation and then you change it a little bit, then they're figuring it out. They're working on it. I'm now looking at, 3 to 6 month olds. They're working it out too, right? I'm showing them videos. They're so thoughtful, and you can see, I like looking at this. I don't like looking at that. It's amazing. So we're making decisions as humans and as non-humans are doing, and we're doing that all the time. So I would like to observe in particular, because I look at sex differences, how males versus females deal with situations when the sex ratio changes. And I think that can have enormous impact on who we are, wherever we are, whatever age we are. But I'm looking at it mostly in young children, so I can observe.
Fascinating. Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll give you Joyce Benenson.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.